Hi there. Kevin Brown from Mission and Ministry and Religious Studies here with you today. Over the past few Thursdays, Mission and Ministry has been inviting us during this time of anxiety and confusion and mourning to consider how we're called to be agents of God's love. And so on this Holy Thursday, as Catholics and many other Christians around the globe prepare tonight to enter into the Holy Triduum, a 3-day liturgical celebration of the Paschal Mystery, I want to invite you to reflect on Jesus' greatest summons to love. In the Gospel reading for tonight's liturgy, we hear the story of Jesus stooping to wash his disciples' feet and calling his disciples, calling all of us to love one another as I have loved you. I love that in John's telling of the story, Jesus is celebrating the Last Supper not with a select group of his disciples, but with the entire community of women and men that had journeyed with him in the midst of the oppression of Roman-occupied Galilee and Judea, proclaiming the message of God's liberating love that they had come to know through their Jewish tradition as they responded to the promptings of God's Spirit. And I think that this is captured really well in this painting by John August Swanson, where, yes, there's this group of disciples in the center of the room, 13, not 12, but beyond them, there's a whole crowd of disciples eagerly peering in, ready to participate in what seems to be this mundane act of foot washing, but what the expressions on their faces tell us is something wondrous. And the liturgist Gabe Huck says that indeed it is wondrous. It's an act that upsets all the expectations of how we act toward one another. It's a deed that turns the world upside down. And at tonight's liturgy, some parish communities would invite the entire assembly to ritually turn the world upside down. Towels and basins of water would be set up throughout the sanctuary as the messiness and the bodiliness of God's love for creation was sacramentally celebrated in the washing of hundreds of pairs of feet. As each person took the feet of another, maybe a friend or a family member, or in many cases a stranger, in their hands, they washed those feet, dried them, maybe kissed them, and then allowed another person to do the same for them. And we would ritually affirm in this action our participation in the work of Jesus to upend the world as we know it, to love one another as Jesus loved us by allowing only the love of God to reign. Right now, the world has been turned upside down, but it's been turned upside down by a virus rather than the love of God. So how in this time of physical distancing, a time marked by pain and suffering and confusion, might we think about the command to love one another, a command that's symbolized by the very tactile means of washing another person's foot, of washing another person's feet. And I've been thinking about this a lot as I've sort of grieved over the past few weeks, the fact that I won't be participating in this liturgy for the first time since I was 12 or 13. And as I've been thinking about it, I keep coming back to the wisdom of one of my favorite theologians, Sandra Schneiders. And she says that when we think of the service enacted by Jesus in the foot washing, we shouldn't think of the type of service that an employee would render an employer, a service rendered on subordinate rank. And we shouldn't think of it as an act of humility or philanthropy, one where a person offers a one-off service to another that the recipient could never reciprocate. In both situations, the service rendered there is rooted in some form of inequality, even if it's benevolently exercised. Instead, we should think of the foot washing in terms of the relationship that Jesus invites his disciples to share at that meal where he washed their feet and said to them, "I do not call you servants, I have called you friends." And Schneiders reminds us, as she says this, that friendship is the one human relationship based on equality. Service rendered between friends is never exacted and creates no debts. It demands no return, but evokes reciprocity and never degenerates into covert exploitation. As Schneiders continues to reflect on Jesus washing his disciples' feet, she says something that speaks to our situation today. And so I'm going to read a longer quote. She writes, Jesus, by transcending the inequality between himself and his disciples and inaugurating between them the relationship of friendship, is subverting in principle all structures of domination. In the Gospel of John, what definitively distinguishes the community that Jesus calls into existence from the power structures so universal in human society is the love of friendship expressing itself in joyful mutual service for which rank is irrelevant. By the foot washing, Jesus, the wisdom of God incarnate, has transcended and transformed the only ontologically based inequality between human beings, that between himself and us. The principle of relationship between Jesus and his disciples is the love of friendship which transforms what would have been a humiliating self-degradation if performed under the formality of superiority and inferiority into an act of service, a revelation of self-giving love. Jesus goes on to say not that the disciples should wash the feet of their inferiors as an act of self-humiliation, for this is not what Jesus had done for them, but rather that they should wash one another's feet. They should live out among themselves the love of friendship with its delight in mutual service that knows no order of importance, which Jesus has inaugurated. The COVID-19 pandemic has been a stark reminder that we do share this fundamental equality that's rooted not only in our shared human dignity, but also our shared human vulnerability. Our parents, our friends, our siblings are just as vulnerable to the virus as a prime minister and a prince, as NBA stars and a folk music legend. But the pandemic has also revealed that the structures of inequality and domination that Jesus sought to subvert by incarnating the love of God continue to mark our shared existence. And we see this when we hear that communities of color and the poor are disproportionately affected by the virus when compared to other communities. We see this when access to healthcare in the midst of a pandemic remains a privilege rather than being acknowledged as a human right. And we see it when it's suggested that the well-being of the stock market is more important than the well-being of vulnerable human beings. This world built by humans, a world that's marked by structures that lead to premature and unjust death, structures that are analogous to the dominative structures of the Roman imperial system that put Jesus to death 2,000 years ago, is the world that the sacramental act of foot washing calls us to turn upside down. The command of Jesus to love one another as he has loved us is a command to find ways of loving every child of God, every other person, even every other creature, as a beloved friend with whom we desire to share a common life. It is, as Schneiders writes elsewhere, a challenge to love in such a way that the good of each is truly the other's good, so that in seeking the good of the friend, one's own good is achieved simply as a byproduct of the friend's happiness and flourishing. And so tonight, while we cannot sacramentally commit ourselves to realizing this vision within our church communities by physically washing one another's feet, we can imagine, we can discern how we might work to enact political, social, and economic reforms that realize more fully the ideal of friendship that Jesus calls us to share with one another. We can imagine how we might live in relationship with one another so that the structures of death on which this pandemic has cast yet another light might be deconstructed. And we can discern how we might work together in joyful hope toward the full realization of the love symbolized by washing one another's feet. A love that on Easter upends our world by overcoming not only the forces of death, but death itself.